Over the past decade, the price of housing has gone up. The question is why? A common question people ask in society is whether they're rising because of Wall Street investment. You'll see numerous headlines discussing major Wall Street firms investing in housing. Perhaps this is driving out regular people from owning their own homes. However, so far in the data, we haven't seen it. A headline is not a representative sample of reality. Over here we have a graph of the home ownership rate in the United States, and it bounces around from time to time. But going back 50 years, the majority of homes are owned by the people who live in them. And the current number is around 66%. Looking at the details of this graph specifically, we see it peaked at 69% back right before the housing crisis, when everybody was buying homes. It took a hit after that, but since 2015, it's been on the path towards greater ownership. But what about the rentals? Who are the landlords? This particular graph is coming from a very detailed study looking at Austin. Messamore 2023 is the reference. Specifically looking at single-family homes, so this doesn't include apartments and condos, etc. The large corporate landlords, defined as those who own more than 50 units, comprise that very skinny dark red line. It's about 1 to 2%, and it hasn't changed much over this decade. Most landlords are either medium-sized businesses, like what we have in the light pink, or largely mom-and-pop owners. And the findings in Austin are largely confirmed by studies looking at other geographies. The Mills, Moley, and Zarutsky paper also finds that large investors only account for 1 to 2% of single-family purchases. And then the Wall Street Journal reports that, quote, big institutional investors only own about 2% of single-family homes. Although they're making a lot of headlines, and the possibility exists that things could worsen in the future, for the time being, large Wall Street investors simply don't own enough of the market to control it and exercise any sort of monopoly power. Well, if it's not them, what is it? Since we've had a large increase in housing prices, we need to find some other change in the market that likewise has been large. Look at these two graphs. The top one is looking at total residential investment each year. So this is the amount of money construction companies are spending building houses. That bright green line tells us what we should be if we were building at historical averages, which between 1960 and 2020 has been 5% of GDP. And as you see over the past decade, there's a gap. Now looking at this other graph to my left, it measures it in total units. This is looking at both single-family and multi-family housing units. Had construction kept a pace, the orange line tells us the long-term average between 1968 and 2000, we would have built millions more. And even accounting for the overconstruction that we did in the mid-2000s, the cumulative gap today is 5.5 million units. This lack of construction is equivalent to a very significant negative supply shock. Less homes being built than normal means a higher price for all, especially if you incorporate population growth, which would increase demand, thus exacerbating home affordability. So why haven't we built enough homes? Most of the data points to an increase in restrictive zoning, meaning that even though people want it, construction firms are not allowed to build enough apartments, enough condos, enough dense housing, or even just expanding single-family housing. This whole restriction receives the nickname NIMBYism. NIMBY standing for not in my backyard. No construction here. And when you have lack of construction, you're going to have higher prices. I mean, the supply and demand of this are not very complicated. And yet it is shocking to see a lot of these conversations. If you increase supply, you're going to lower the price. Now, there are a few complications to this. Most of the middle class keeps their wealth in real estate, not necessarily in the stock market. Most of the stock market is owned by the top 10%, for example. So there's this incentive, especially in local politics, for the upper middle class to preserve or even expand the value of their land by going into city council and preventing construction so that everyone could afford it. So this has harmed some of the generational gap. For example, the majority of homeownership wealth is held by the boomer generation, and millennials are continuing to make progress. The majority of millennials now own their home. Relative to the age of Gen X and baby boomer generation, millennials are still behind. The good news, for now at least, is that the older Gen Zs are purchasing homes at a really good rate. The caveat to this is that a big chunk of them are receiving their down payments from their wealthy parents. Until we build more housing and supply according to what the market demands, home prices and rental prices will remain elevated for the time being.